Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alexandre Alaphilippe, the Executive Director of EU organization based in Brussels and studying and countering disinformation in Europe. So first, I'd like to thank Carnegie Europe for hosting this event in their premises, and thank you to all of you for being there with us, especially those who made it to the office despite the beautiful weather outside in Brussels. It's unusual, so thank you for preferring a talk here than to enjoy your beer outside. And thank you to everybody who is also following us on YouTube. Today's topic is, the title was Understanding the Information Environment to Protect Democracy. And it's true that many of us have been feeling that something has changed in the way information works, flows in our societies. And the easy reaction that we currently see is to blame the latest technology, blame the most obvious falsehood we've just seen online, but that really doesn't explain the full picture of what we are living. So let me use a well-known image. The Titanic didn't sink because of the iceberg the crew could see. It sank because of what was under the sea, what was not unseen, which tore apart openly the ship. In the same way, maybe our democracies are like the Titanic, very large, hard to maneuver, very slow, but going to the same direction. And we see dangers ahead. We see new information systems. We see private platforms that can decide what can be said. We see algorithms that can decide what we can see. And we also see traditional media losing power and revenue. But what we often forget to ask is, are these problems connected? Are these dangers only isolated icebergs, or is there something we don't see under the water? Are there more risks that we haven't identified yet? And most importantly, can we still change direction before it's too late? Tonight, with the help of our speakers, we'll try to explore the deeper layers of the information environment. We may not find all the answers tonight, I must warn you, but asking the right questions is already a good start. We'll hear from people who play different roles in this place, and we see how also their responsibilities are changing. So I'm honored to chair this conversation and to welcome such respected guests with me, and I look forward to what we will learn together. So we are joined tonight by Alicia Wanless, Dr. Alicia Wanless. We must say, Alicia is the director of the Information Environment Project at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which aims to foster evidence-based policymaking for the information environment. You're also the author of a book, which you might have seen at the entrance, called The Information Animal, Humans, Technology, and the Competition for Reality. Congratulations on this, and we know it's a long journey. We're also here with Marie-Doha Besancenot. Marie-Doha, good evening. Until recently, you were NATO Assistant Secretary General in charge of comms issues. You recently changed to a new environment. You are now Senior Stratcom Advisor to the French Foreign Minister, a post that has been created to boost France's political response to disinformation. And we also join with Delphine Colard. Good evening, Delphine. Delphine, you are the spokesperson of the European Parliament and the head of the spokesperson unit, and you lead the team coordinating the Parliament's effort to counter disinformation, misinformation, and foreign interference. Before we start with the full discussion, I would like to ask you, Alicia, we talk about information environment, information ecology. What does it mean? How we can define this? How did you came up with that notion?
Right, so one of the reasons why we have other people from Stratcom on here is that I used to work in strategic communication, and I, when doing that, got very interested in how propaganda might be changing in a digital age. And so I started digging further, but what was really bothering me was that I'd never really found a very good evidence-based explanation for why some campaigns worked, if they worked at all. And there was a lot of mistaking correlation for causation. And there was a lot of focus also on target audiences and what we wanted them to do. But that didn't really take into account all the variables that go into people's making decisions. So I started looking around the propaganda, literally the environment. And of course, there was lots of discussion at that time in military circles about the information environment. But I thought that if we're going to use these metaphors, maybe we could dig a little bit deeper and actually see what physical ecology could teach us about the information environment. Were there methods that could be borrowed? So this led me down a little bit of a different path, which is the basis of the book. I looked at the history of physical ecology, and sure enough, there were similarities. In the 1700s, when scientists were looking at the environment around them, it was really mechanistic. So animals were like machines, humans were not really a part of the natural world. You had people studying plants, people studying animals, and they didn't really look at the system. That was until Alexander von Humboldt goes to Venezuela and South America and sees the destruction around Lake Valencia and comes up with this concept of ecosystems. And it took a man to step back and see how these things are all interrelated. And so one application I thought was possible was studying ecosystems, which emerged from people using tools to process and share information into outputs, and the relationships between them and how those work.
Yeah, and you have this fantastic anecdote in the book about the ecosystem is so complex that sometimes the easy solution is not the one you're looking at. So you're looking at pesticides and the impact on eagle's nest and eagle's eggs, if I remember well, and trying to reproduce in a laboratory the same experiment and to feed birds with pesticide to see if it has an impact, but it doesn't work because actually the whole chain is completely different.
Right, that's an interesting story. So there were lots of birds of prey, falcons in particular. In the 50s, it was discovered that their eggs were thinning to the point where only a fifth were reproducing. And because pesticides, in particular DDT, had just come out, everybody believed that was the cause. Now, the good news was that there were people called oologists who collect eggs. They had built up decades of egg collections, so they knew the pinpoint of when it changed, which is great, but you still can't prove causation. And it took this one scientist who was both a toxicologist and a lover of birds, who understood how falcons received DDT. They didn't take it directly, they got it through the food chain, so it was broken down and it was a byproduct. When he realized this and thought about it that way, he was able to replicate what was happening in the wild. But the examples before, they were just like, here's some DDT, falcons, why aren't your eggs thinning? And I think sometimes when we're doing experiments related to social media to prove that it's causing polarization, it's a bit like that. We look directly and only at the social media usage to try to replicate a problem we're seeing, and it's not working, probably because we don't understand the system around it.
I'm keeping the idea of the toxicologist and the bird lover for later, because I think there are things to dig there. Marie-Doha, you've been working at NATO on real Stratcom and trying to understand how this was evolving in terms of informational attacks on NATO countries and how to have resilience against this. And you're also now in another position at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. How have you perceived a change in the information environment that you've been surrounded with and by, and what does it mean for NATO or a ministry's office as an agent that receives information, produces information in your daily role on how you perceive these kind of informational attacks?
Thank you. I think being able to speak from both vantage points is very useful in this respect, because you see the beautiful work we're doing on the grammar, on the process, and then you see what happens when you have a hands-on approach, and you realize that you keep learning because no single attack in the information space or no single phenomenon is similar to the one you dealt with the weekend before. And if you apply the same recipes, you risk either increasing it or really not treating it right. So I think the thing that we've been observing, so I've been in my new role for 2 months, but that's enough to observe a whole series of different attacks in the information space. What we see, I would say, and what's very hard to handle, and also which is why your approach of an ecosystem really matters, is that we see a whole variety of different objects. So the French way was to focus on inauthentic, so digital inauthentic, coordinated attacks. But what we see today is a complete variety of things, which can be basic political interference or blatant trolling, very openly, nothing secret, nothing even digital about that, combined with other things which are really digital, inauthentic, cyber. And what is very hard for an organization is really to handle all these at the same time when we grasp symptoms after symptoms. So for an organization like NATO or like a nation like France, I think we all invested in tools and in people. So tools to analyze all this, be better prepared, understand what is happening. And then people who are really translators of this, so translators of all those dashboards and those wonderful visualization tools that we now have into messaging recommendations. And my experience right now, which I never expected to go through, is actually having to calm down your leaders who are super eager to get into the fight, and actually saying, please don't communicate, don't make that joke. It's not going to have the effect you think. And of course, that's the hardest element because we can't predict exactly. So there's a lot of AI right now work on predictive, but we're still not there. And what I see is really, because it's so complex right now, you do need to have all the analysis, but you still have the human, highly political element of making those recommendations.
A combination of really what the system is doing, but what all the mass of individual agents can do, which can go into an unpredictable behavior. I think what is interesting also what you say is about the kind of the more, so you have to fight to actually have people researching, studying, and when you have this kind of data being there, it's being a bit captured or just like, it's so exciting that you have so much data that you want to act on it. So how can you keep some kind of a balance between the kind of not knowing and then maybe knowing too much and willing to act on a too short-term basis? Is that a struggle?
Yes, it is. Because if you say no to someone who's super eager to communicate after you told him or her that being ironic is going to work and using humor and being, daring is a good thing, and then you say no, then you better have a good explanation for why this particular way of addressing this attack won't work or will have a different effect. I think one way of doing it is precisely thinking in terms of different circles of effectors and showing that, no, we're not doing nothing. We're just telling you not to expose yourself on this, but we can have different types of answers. And this applied to NATO also, of course. There's a main spokesperson of the alliance, but then there's a spokesperson, and then we have allies, we have institutional accounts. There's a whole array, and then, of course, civil society.
Delphine, on your side, the European Parliament has been very active in providing a lot of reliable information during European elections. I think that's one of the most visible moments for the European Parliament to actually take the floor, to explain what's the role of the European Parliament, what to do, which I'm pretty sure 5, 10, 15 years ago was not that much into the role of spokesperson unit and spokesperson of the Parliament. So could you share more about these efforts and what they bring in practice and what improvements you envision on that?
Yes, I think starting from the book of Alicia, I think the idea of this all-parliamentary democracy ecosystem at the moment is built on this idea that citizens can make free and informed choices, and that's the way democracy is shaped at the moment. And the whole information campaign that the Parliament is running is always to boost this aspect of, can we just engage the people so that they are in capacity to make those free informed choices about the choices they make for Europe in the European Parliament. We know it's a bit more complicated than that. So there are twofold in our actions. It's more inform and engage about the importance to go to vote, to use your vote, because otherwise people will make choices for you. So that's one. And it's the whole campaign that the Parliament has been engaging with, also testimonials from older generation on the importance of democracy that had a lot of views online, and this is one. But of course, another element was, of course, with the attempts expected and visible to distort the information space, was to boost the resilience, to prevent it from having an impact on the electoral process in itself. And there, I think we acted in different ways, boosting the information, because we mapped a bit what the experience was from the different member states in the months leading to the European elections. And we built on Estonia and the Nordic countries in particular to develop a website that was not only providing the practicalities on how you vote in each member state, but also a dedicated section on free and fair elections and how all the measures that were existing at European level, but at national levels, and contact points on how the elections were like safeguarded from a data point of view, but also from election integrity, but also what is disinformation, what are the risks of interference, and what can you do about it. We didn't do that alone. I think cooperation was instrumental. We did it together with the Commission, with the External Action Service. We built on the studies by NATO partners, by DisinfoLab, by the European Digital Media Observatory, or EFCSN as fact checkers, because in the Parliament, this idea of the whole society is very present in all the reports that have been drafted by the members and adopted in plenary. Even if it's not considered as the silver bullet, a lot of emphasis was put on awareness raising and resilience building, with videos explaining the disinformation tactics, with tips and tricks, with engaging multipliers ahead of the elections to, well, inoculate a bit their audience, speak to content creators, speak to multipliers, speak to the civil society organizations, so they could explain the benefit of participating in the vote, engaging, but also the risks that were ahead of us. And something that was a bit new this time, beyond engaging the media and engaging the communities, was exposing the risk. I think we chose together with the Commission and External Action Service to have those briefings where we were really exploring all the difficulties and different patterns that we were seeing ahead of the elections, to say, we see this, we don't expect an impact on the result of the elections, because we are ready. Because we are ready interinstitutionally, because we are ready with our NATO G7 partner, because we are ready with our member states. We did tabletop exercises, we prepared for hybrid threats, and that was a slightly different message. And if I compare 2019 with 2024, I think the very big difference was this creation of an ecosystem of different actors ready to build synergies to have this message out. And of course, we didn't see major attempts during European elections, but we know that the situation is not perfectly rosy. If you look at recent national elections, we see those same attempts with doppelganger, portal combat, others replicating. So we're definitely not out of the hook.
So it's interesting what you're saying, because you're saying also about the role of, you mentioned the whole of society, and to have also different people being able to take the floor, so that you are not the only centralized voice, but also like providing elements, so actually more people can do this. And it's a bit like Palo Alto communication theory about two-step flow communication, so having multiple people taking the floor and having different kind of opinion leaders. We used to call this, we call them influencers now. But very interesting to have that kind of multiplication of spaces to discuss, and much more information produced with much more capillarity into the information ecosystem that are happening. Could you see that in the content that was done in partnership with influencers, that it was helping to bring the debate to somewhere else and to ignite or to initiate?
That top-down communication from only institutions reaches a certain number of people, but we wanted to go from like institution to people, from people to people, and we really wanted to engage multipliers, civil society organizations, content creator, because we saw that the result was there. We had people more committed that also were speaking in a community of the language or a topic they are very fond of, be it from environmental protection to other topics of interest that could engage in the importance of democracy and protecting it. So they were engaging in their different capacities, but they were reinforcing the same message. And this is advocated again in the Democracy Shield Special Committee in the European Parliament, because they continue to advocate for, yes, a pooling out of resources, but also working with multipliers, working with the different strands of action, so that we reinforce each other the same message and make our democracy and information space more resilient. Because it's not disappearing. In the Parliament, we have attacks every day. Parliament is allegedly a censor, is useless at the same time, but is also autocratic in deciding on the life of citizens and suppressing elections. There are direct attacks against members of the institution, so it's not becoming an easier task.
Yeah. What is very interesting in this vision of decentralization and having more agents and more creators of information in the information ecosystem, and I'm telling to you, Alicia, I think it's interesting because it gets away from the discussion about the content, because the content doesn't mean that much in that case. It's also about how it spreads, what are the different environments it can spread on, what are the different bodies that can centralize, decentralize, block information, what are the circumvention of this, because it's actually more like a flow more than a road.
Well, yes. I mean, it's a complex system that these component parts and people, tools, and outputs create together, right? And so they're very emerging and they're dynamic and they change all the time. I think one challenge is, and Marie-Doha kind of spoke to that a little bit, is that we are looking at it all in pieces though. I mean, it's great that we're starting to see collaboration in terms of response, but we don't necessarily have that consilience or cooperation across research. We have lots of different focuses that are pretty narrow. So each one looks at the information environment through their own lens, and if you ask each one, they have a different definition for what they're talking about. The media studies person thinks it's news media. The person who cares about digital media is going to say it's social media. The person working in business says it's the organization where they're making financial decisions. And they're all right in a way. These are ecosystems. But if we don't get to a point where we're talking about the same thing, we can't actually bridge different disciplines and we can't systematize research. So right now we're missing some of the things that would actually help us understand if an ecosystem was resilient is a baseline, right? We don't have long-term measurements to tell us that this is the state of a, say, national information ecosystem at any given time, and this is how it's changed after this action. And we don't really have a lot of longitudinal or meta-analysis of all the case studies that are being done, and those are kind of like field work. So those need to be sorted out to get a bigger picture, and maybe with the two of them together, we can provide a better picture to design experiments so we can find causation. And when we get to that bigger picture, then we know what we're operating in, and then we can design solutions. And I think there's another aspect of this too. If we step back and look at this, we might be able, well, we can identify who would need to be part of a whole of society solution. Right now, it's the people who have the most evident reason to be there, right? It's the people who are already doing a particular function, but we may be missing people who work on adult skills, right? Or we may be missing the people who control all of the complex infrastructure or look at the infrastructure that underlies the system. So they're not often at the table, and maybe that's because we haven't really stepped back. So we don't even know what we're missing.
Yeah, there have been a lot of focus about content moderation in the past years in Brussels, and content moderation for me always falls in the problem of about designing what piece of content should be there or not. And whereas we have all the underlying component of this, which is the recommender systems that are distributing this content, the centralization of content by the platforms. We were mentioning like influencers, but all of these stakeholders are dependent of what the platforms can offer as services, as a way to distribute the stuff, and they are a bit of a central thing here. We never talk about advertisement and all advertising companies. We know that there has been for a very long time, we know an incapacity to study where around 25% of the money in advertising is going, because it goes through to so many middlemen that we actually lose track of where the money is going. So all of the distribution mechanism is completely opaque right now, for instance.
Underlying conditions of why people might even be open to receiving this in the first place. Like when I think about a place like the UK that had riots last year after the stabbing attack, you know, you've got a big increase in new people that's maybe changing the demographics of the country, but you've also been having a decrease in literacy rates. At the same time, new technologies, of course, are coming in, and the outputs are changing. So you have a collapse of local media. You have tabloids who for the last decade have been fanning the fears around migration and other grievances related to that, and the economic conditions haven't been great. You've had an economic downturn, social services are declining. This is a climate that I think disinformation, wherever it comes from, domestic or foreign actors, is going to keep happening, and you can get rid of the content, but it's going to happen again because the conditions are right for it.
Yeah, and because, as we mentioned at the beginning, the ecosystem in the environment is not static. It's in perpetual dynamic. So it's also very impossible. Is it possible, according to you, just like to isolate specific indicators or specific case studies? Because like the complexity of the systems makes it very and very hard to understand, is it that technology? Is it because it had this threshold? Is it because these many actors start to use it? It's like, how can we single this?
Well, I think you have to start somewhere. Right now, I mean, the discussion always seems to be, well, it's too big, it's too complex. Well, so was the physical environment is very complex. Physics is very complex, and yet people study it. So I think really it's about starting somewhere. Not related, well, yes, related to the book, but we've been working for the last year at Carnegie on a way of assessing national information ecosystems. And we've identified 16 categories of factors that could be a starting point, that could be done repeatably across countries to get some sort of sense of what each ecosystem is and what its state is at that time and over time. So I think it's possible. We have to start somewhere. It's not going to be an instant solution.
Yeah, you mentioned there is, at the beginning of the book, there is something very interesting about what is information, because we also tend to confuse information with news. You have this story about, you're in a train station and you're actually, you're watching your Starbucks cup or any kind of coffee cup that you have bought, and there's like some information on this. There is your name, so you have information there. You have a radio song playing in the hall of the car. At the same point, you have the train, the destination, is it late or not? You have your phone ringing. You have a smell of the bakery there. So you're just like, the information around you is a lot. So understanding also of this also means understanding all kind of information as animals. The book is titled Information Animals. We also have to deal with. It's not only about what we read online.
This is why I'm so inspired by early ecologists, is because they started to put forward an understanding that humans are not separate from the environment, and we are not separate from the information environment. We are part and parcel of it. It shapes us and we shape it. And until we understand that, I think that we're going to be doomed to repeat the same mistakes.
Yeah. Marie-Doha, I think somehow in the kinetic space, like NATO has been seen, where you worked for NATO, just like NATO has been seen as, like kinetic organization, like moving troops, exercise, etc., which is very much unlinked to information. But if we take this kind of dimension of information also being people moving from a country, from a base to another, and what kind of information people can perceive of that, has it been trying to integrate and to connect what's happening in the real world versus what's being perceived as information into the information environment?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I would say that was one of the most interesting parts of the job. Even though I was at the head of a division called public diplomacy, which seems very far from what you're describing, I think what we've done with the team is really showing how this division was really part of the global situational awareness, and situational awareness is where everything starts, right? So there is intel people will do what intel people do. There is the political advisors who have all the political context, provide elements for meetings. But with all the tools that we have, and because the information space has changed so much, now we have the ability to provide key elements on perception. So of course, we didn't start from scratch. We always had audience research. That was very much part of the DNA. And NATO has always been very good at knowing where audiences stand, how secure they feel, how ready they are to fight for their neighbor, and how protected they feel, and so on. But in addition to that, NATO has invested a lot in tools to analyze immediate perceptions, and that is absolutely necessary to make sure that you have the right response and that you're able to perform what we're asked to perform, which is reassure, deter, provide unity, explain the legitimacy, and create trust. So yes, definitely.
Alicia, in the book, you also talk about competition in the information environment, which happens every case that you have multiple agents that are trying to competing to impose their own vision of the information on the others. And I'm turning to Delphine, who will hate me for this question, but I have to ask it, of course. We're joking about this now. So I think it's very interesting to see that in the European Parliament now, we have actually inside the Parliament much more information competition than we had before. And how, because we have multiple more groups than we had ever, if I'm not mistaken, in the European Parliament, or not far, in terms of like democratic representation of the vote, and with like a lot of information competition between this, on like every group trying to impose its narrative, compared to what we, I would say, are used to have in Brussels, which are like discussions, compromise, agreement on the overall goal, etc. How this information competition is making the job easier, harder? I have a hint on that.
The former diplomat in me would say more interesting. It's indeed very dynamic in the parliament. But it's also what makes the parliament a very unique place. I think it's one of the added value of the parliament is that it captures probably more than other institutions what is living in the society, because you have those elections that are really translated into political groups that indeed have very different vision of the way they want Europe to be constructed and the future to be good. And they discuss openly in a transparent way. And it's not behind closed doors. It's in committees, it can be confrontational, it's in plenary with very different interventions taking place on all topics. This is the beauty of it. It's very open and transparent. And of course, it does not make it easy, because in the end, you've got to explain that there is a process of compromise building to reach out a moment of negotiation with their counterparts in the council to reach out to a result that is acceptable for a majority. The difficulty is that the majority that was in place for decades in the European Parliament is also shifting, and you have a greater volatility between what is possible in a committee and what is possible in plenary. You have more difficulties to replicate what is possible in an environment committee, where you have, even from different political groups, people that are like attached to this question, than you would have to replicate at the level of a plenary, where you have potentially people that are more interested in industry, in rights of minorities and migration questions. But yeah, this is the added value of asking people to go to vote, in a way. They get what they voted for. Then sometimes they say, oh, but that's not what we wanted, because it makes things more complicated. And you say, yes, but it translates. Using your vote has an impact. It does not come to a neutral position where the parliament continues as usual. And it shapes, indeed, all the information world also in Brussels, because you have different voices that were never heard, that have no the floor, that are some things that are very unusual, that are said in the plenary, that can be provocative, that can be intriguing, that can be sometimes raising the alert. Voilà. So I think for other institutions, it's an adaptation. And I think also for sometimes citizens watching the debates, because they realize that the voices, this idea that there was a common pro-European majority that had exactly the same view is absolutely not true. Even in this pro-European majority, you have very different perspectives on how the future should look like. Yeah, and how legislation should be shaped, also in the question of information and protecting our information space. The heavy debate on democracy shield and what it should look like shows that for some people it's complete abuse and it goes in the direction of censorship, and for others it's more than a necessity and should have been done years ago to make sure that we can protect our elections, protect our information space, protect our media, and a way to shape democracy.
Alicia, so you wrote this book about the information environment and trying to understand what are the different components of it, what should be done in terms of studying it. My question is will it also be provocative? Just like we have the impression that we have a deterioration of this information environment. We have the impression that it's that due to the backsliding of liberal democracy in the West, it's harder and harder than the information competition is harder and harder. We also see coming back more top-down communications. We're mentioning here, we don't know it, we know it's not working, but we actually see that sometimes we're going back to that very, very hierarchical way. I was watching publications on a social media owned by an American oligarch who sends cars in space. And at some point it was very interesting to see that we could see coordinated user behavior. We could see like right-wing influencers copy-pasting the exact same message altogether. It's like, this is really top-down communication. It's like you have something and everybody repeats the same thing. So do you think that we have this feeling of urgency? Is it, according to you, like just a feeling that we should fight in terms of like, yes, we have this feeling, but like the most important is to put in place the study? Should we try to apply some kind of bandages of what we think, where we think the wound is? Should we consider that the system is broken? So should we fix the system or trying to come with new things?
Well, that's a lot of questions.
Yes.
Did you want me to save society or something?
No,
It's
the
a little-
world in general. I have high hopes.
Okay, well, you're going to get a long answer. So one of the things that I did, I was trying to build a theory of the information environment. So that meant looking at ecosystems throughout time. So I started with ancient Greece and ended with Ukraine around 2014. And I took case studies that were after the introduction of a new technology that changed how information was processed and shared, but also before the outbreak of war, because I was in war studies for my PhD, and that interests me. Obviously, we need to also study places where they didn't end up in war. But there were a few things that repeated in each of them. One was that, yes, there was a new technology that was introduced, but it usually came along with other things that happened. So, for example, in England, after the printing press, yes, you had cheap pamphlets that spread a lot of trashy information, both conspiracy theories about the king as well as about deformities and horror stories and things that just weren't true, because people have always liked that. And it was a business. So you had a business model problem back then. But it also came along with canals and a new postal system that helped move it a lot faster. The second thing that happened was that more and more people were able to engage in this public sphere than before. Sometimes that was because they gained literacy, right? So this happened in England, it happened in the northern United States before the Civil War. Sometimes it was because restrictions were removed, like Ukraine after the Soviet Union. Sometimes it was both, like in Vietnam. They gained literacy and international travel, and this raised expectations. So the third thing that came along was that a new idea emerged that challenged an existing one. And often what happens when this occurs is that the pre-existing idea digs in, and these two communities start to compete in their ecosystem for the public to take their viewpoint. Where this becomes problematic is when those two realities can't coexist and compromise can't be found. But these two communities will use all the tools and available means to try to bring people on, and it escalates into conflict. So am I worried that the information environment and ecosystems today are degrading? It's not so much that, but that I see that we already have this information competition going on. We already have in many ecosystems split in realities. And I don't know how we come back from that, but that's the thing that is the most pressing. I think there's other issues within that. And if countries were to, and again, it can take a couple of months to build teams to assess national information ecosystems, maybe we can start to tease out where the most pressing vulnerabilities are to deal with things. I don't think it's going to be in regulation. I think it's actually in addressing vulnerabilities within different layers. So it might be that you're dependent on a certain software provider, or maybe social media, right? And so that alternatives would need to be developed very quickly to wean people off of that or to fix that gap.
Do you think Europe has a role to play there?
Of course, Europe has a role to play there. I mean, recently, it's behind a paywall, forgive me, but Heidi Twork and I wrote a piece in the Hill Times in Canada suggesting that we've had a model of public broadcast before when we were worried about sovereignty. Why can't we apply that to finding alternatives for social media? And Blue Sky is an example of how much it would cost. I mean, we also have to consider, you can't just put something out there and hope people will do it. It's got to be comparable. There's got to be interoperability. You've got to have data portability. Build it such that people will want to leave the other one. And maybe that can be done in a decentralized way where countries in Europe have their own that apply to their local laws. Canada has it, and we can connect it between, but we can protect users in our own countries. So maybe as a community, we could.
I think the parallel you're drawing with interoperability is very important, and I think Europe has been playing an important role in this, I think, compared to many other parts of the world. In terms of telecoms, we have, as consumers and as Europeans, we have a much more lower price for our telecoms because it's...
Talk to our country, please.
Yes. And we also have interoperability, meaning that, I want to change provider, I can keep my phone number. Looks very simple because we've done this like 10 times already. But we have to understand this is not happening on social media. If we want to change provider of social media, we have to build everything from scratch. We can't bring our contacts. We can't bring our phone book. We can't bring the content, the SMS we had, etc. So interoperability and telecoms is a way that Europe has shown something can be done against big companies that did not want to have this being happening. So the question of the infrastructure is actually quite central into this. Marie-Doha, on your field, like now on ministers' cabinet, how does it work in terms of helping to build this kind of assessment of the information environment? Is there something? Is there appetite for that at national level to go to that level, which is not an operational and activable level in terms of political gain, but really in terms of whole society? I make very long questions, I'm sorry.
I would say France is a very good example of this for sad reasons, which is the attacks 10 years ago, which made it very clear that campaigns in the information space were not just comms or a side effect of something else, but were really a matter of national security. And as a nation which was never really interested in marketing and considered it very vulgar and so never really invested in that, I think France approached the information environment immediately via the security angle. And I think it still is very strong in the way we approach it today. And as a consequence, a couple of structures have been put in place. So Visionim is well known, so a specific agency with a very specific mandate, which France has been able to approve, contrary to other nations, without much contestation, because the mandate is very well framed, where indeed it is about analyzing, tracking, and being able to describe and qualify something as a coordinated attack, and then give it to the political leaders to decide whether they want to call it out or not. And this is where the foreign minister has a role, whether it's appropriate politically or whether you choose other means to, bring evidence more discreetly to your counterparts and say that never again. So there are different ways of doing it. So yes, it's been taken very seriously. The second element is this cross-government approach, which I think, and coming back to my NATO role, it was very obvious that every nation is getting there, and that it really starts with people in charge of energy and agriculture also caring about this, because in the end, it's all about resilience and creating the tools for that. So trying to overcome rivalries between ministries and so on. So France has done that, and I'm now very fortunate to be part of those coordination mechanisms. And we always think, oh, it could be better, but I think a lot of the hardest has been done, which is getting all those different cultures together and to consider the levers of all the different ministers as a possible continuum of effects, and then choose from that for each situation. And I think there's some value in the formal existence of those committees, but there's even more value in the informal existence of this little community of people who spend their weekends evaluating the risks, and with that element of trust that we can actually reveal, yes, we think there's a vulnerability there, we think we should go this far, and share our sometimes very different approaches to come up with a joint answer. And so we have leaders who are now timing us. And so 2 weeks ago, it took us 1 hour to come up with a solution in a cross-government approach. So we were told it was not good enough, but I think it's quite good as a cross-government. When we realize where we come from, just being able to do this, I think is already something.
Anybody who worked in any cross-department know that coming with a solution with cross-department in 1 hour is already a good success, but between government, it's even better. Yes, that was I was actually thinking of. I think we might have questions from the audience.
I saw a flashcard.
So flashcard, that's why. I'm happy to take questions from the audience. 1, 2, and 3.
Thanks. I have to confess, I didn't read the book before coming. And after hearing you present it, I really feel bad about that. It looks really interesting, the way you went to Humboldt and the ancient Greeks. I wasn't expecting that for a discussion on the media ecosystem.
It literally just arrived like a couple of hours ago.
So I feel less guilty. Thanks so much. In fact,
Could you introduce yourself?
Sorry. Sebastian Whitechurch-Brack. I represent the Kofi Annan Foundation in Brussels. And a few years ago, we actually put together a high-level commission with a research team at Stanford to look at how social media and the internet were changing elections. And after 1 year of research and visits and all that, they came to the conclusion that actually the key facts were actually not so much the communication and the information, but rather the pre-existing political and social system in which the information was deployed, very much in line with what you're saying about the ecosystem. And so in fact, the key factors that could predict whether information, disinformation might lead to destabilization, violence, etc., was the level of pre-existing cleavages, polarized media, trust in institutions, this kind of thing. So not actually the information at all, but actually the pre-existing social, political. And my concern, if you agree with that, is that knowing how the democracy shield is being shaped, it's all about protecting ourselves against foreign interference, but it neglects the fact that many of the reasons why our systems, including America's, are so vulnerable to this stuff is because we have a decline of trust. We have a problem of input and output legitimacy within our democratic societies. And isn't there a risk of focusing on this question of FIMI at the expense of actually addressing the underlying democratic problems we have in our societies that make us vulnerable to this stuff? And our report showed that different democracies are very unequally exposed. So I'm also Swiss, you may not know. And Switzerland doesn't have a huge problem of these things because there's a high trust in our institutions. And America actually, this was before Trump had already been elected, showed America had a very high problem because of pre-existing polarized media in Rush Limbaugh, Fox News. And so in fact, I'm just worried now Europe might be going down this stream of focusing on external threats and not looking at what ails our democracies internally. So I'm wondering what your views are on that. I apologize for speaking so long.
Thank you. We're going to take questions in a row, if that's fine.
Okay. Because I was keen to do that one.
I'm taking notes, but I'm putting your name there. So
Then I have to remember the question.
I have the question.
Hello. I am Mehmet Onur Çevik. I'm coming from Center for Future Generations. We are based in Brussels. So I have a question for Alicia. And I also did my PhD on, like media studies and kind of polarization and everything. I was just curious because the title of your book is very neutral, like information animal. But right now we talked about disinformation mostly. So when I was investigating politically hybrid regimes and how propaganda works, and of course Turkey was my case study, I was like questioning sometimes these bad ideas or like kind of disinformation can be, it's seen as a kind of virus, kind of spreads because it kind of speaks to your emotions and all that. But do you also see good ideas would spread in the same way in those like information ecosystems? For example, think of gender movement, like gender equality movement or anti-racism movement or all these. So do you see ideas just spread in the same way, or do you see there are like differences when it comes to disinformation and maybe like more healthy and beneficial ideas?
Thank you. Can take these two ones.
Okay.
First, okay. First one, you want me to repeat the question?
I'll do this one first so you don't have to repeat things.
Okay.
I'll be clear that I am trying to study the system, so not necessarily the spread of information. But I would point to Jonah Berger's book, Contagious. He had found earlier evidence that other things like awe, so this is like scientific innovations, were also being shared quite heavily. Emotions like happiness and joy, like those videos of people coming home and it's a surprise that they weren't expected and stuff tend to move. So I think that there's all sorts of emotional responses. They're called arousing emotions. That's what he calls it, not me. It's in his book, please. I would probably come up with something else, but that there are different types of emotions, not just anger, that motivate us to share things. So I think it's possible, and there has been moves to that. I think there's potentially, and again, I'm guessing, I'm not a psychologist, but I think maybe there is something a little bit broken in us humans that we tend to, well, I do, because I'm a security studies person, lean towards the dark stuff, right? And that does also sell, and maybe that's easier. So I think, you know, it's a trade-off, and maybe sometimes people don't want to take the risk. To the first question, I will go, and then I'll open up the floor for other responses. So first off, I have hope that the European Union, the Commission, is currently undertaking a consultative process about this, so that maybe FEME is not the be-all and end-all that Democracy Shield will focus on. So I have hope that there will be more input that encourages them to take a more systemic view, because one of the reasons is, as again, a war studies person, it's impossible to be strategic if you don't understand your environment. Like, strategy is really about making the best possible choices from an array of options to get to an aim. And so you can't do that if you don't really know what all the options are. And I think really focusing on narrow things sometimes misleads us into thinking that that's the problem we have to deal with, but maybe it's underlying causes. And then back to the ecosystem thing, I mean, there's a chapter in the book that looks at Finland in juxtaposition to the US and Canada. And Alexandre will appreciate this very much, because at all the conferences we attend, somebody inevitably brings up Finland as being this great example of dealing with disinformation. And that was supposedly because they implemented a strong media literacy program. The Finns don't like to hear this, and it's probably, I mean, they agree, media literacy tends to be a bit of a trigger word. Because their ecosystem is very strange compared to everybody else's. It's highly homogenous. Their language isn't really mutually intelligible with much else except maybe Estonian. They have a great education system, high rates of education, better rates of gender equality and income equality. They've got a higher trust in their media. Their media is less polarized, from my understanding. They also still invest in the public broadcaster, which a lot of Finns still watch. They still invest in libraries. They have like a mobile library that drives around up north. But they also have an existential threat on their border that's very much something that's in their living memory with the Winter War, and they know that they've got a clear and pressing threat. Are those things applicable to the US? Not likely. And implementing the same measures that maybe Finns may backfire in the US. And so this is why I think we need to get multiple understandings built up, and not just of a snapshot, over decades. And then that may be giving us some indication of what works in one type of ecosystem versus another.
Delphine, on these.
Maybe on yes, because you were asking the question. I think the Democracy Shield is indeed, we are finalizing the consultation. And I think one of the reasons it's pushed to third quarter is also to have a broader scope, because otherwise it would just replicate existing papers on FEME and disinformation, and they published that 2 years ago. So the added value this time was really to go broader and have the election aspect, have the educational aspect, have the preparedness aspect included, intelligence. So that's the reason it goes broader than from the Director General that was originally carrying the project. And if we look at the readiness plan of the Commission, or the preparedness study of UNISTO, you find this question of information integrity placed in that context too, from defense to resilience of democracy in the electoral context. So probably we can hope it's going to be part of the proposal of the Commission when it comes after the summer. At least it's the willingness in the Parliament, because the rapporteur, Tobias Tobias, just issued a working paper, and I think it just shows that the Parliament expectations are very vast and do not, yes, there is a part on FEME, definitely, but it's a page among other tons of other topics that they want to be addressed in this context to protect democracy. Just on the news that travel fast, maybe a Belgian example, because I'm the Belgian of the crowd. In Belgium, you had this choice during the attacks in Brussels to have videos of cats propagating, because it was supposed to be positive. It was not giving any information to potential incident, and it was the police that said, if you want to share things, share these, because it's not giving any information. And you could see the whole population in Brussels sharing cats pictures, So you can have a different types of information traveling fast. And it's also because there is this the specific mood in Belgium, probably, that you probably would not have that in Paris, but But it's interesting to see that you can use the same social media for a different purpose if one moment there is a common understanding that for the good of the society at that moment, we should not spread those negative news. We should not spread about the casualties. We should not speak about the incidents, but we should just let them work and cover the operation by another type of information that we want to spread to give another perspective on what's happening. Just the Belgian touch.
Maybe one word on the question between CME and how do you complement this with something which is a strong discourse on what you stand for. So are you proactive Stockholm, basically your values and so on. I think it's inevitable that we deal with both at a national level, and if you scrutinize the information environment, it's very obvious that campaigns are completely intertwined, whether they're purely opportunistic or whether they're coordinated or whether it's just a convergence of views. But it's obvious that, especially since a couple of months ago, where you have national actors, you can have traditional adversarial actors like Russian bots, and then you have also new actors who happen to be influencers with 30 million followers amplifying certain narratives, then it really changes the way, I mean, it gives an incredible visibility to your internal actors, which were, you know, sort of trapped in a bind, and now really reaching a different level that forces really organizations and governments to think more about what they have to offer. And I think this is one thing that really struck me at NATO, also working with youth, and when we were talking about values, and the youth were really open about challenging this and saying, what values, you know, why your values, yours, and why are they better than the other ones? And we ended up having discussions on why we believe democracy is the best regime, and you know, and they would take it away and say, I'm taking this away with me, I'll think about it, and I'll compare it with the other guys are proposing. And I think this is something very hard to accept for governments and ministries, especially if you're a defense or MFA. But it's the reality that you probably need to communicate very differently to avoid this polarization, and especially now to avoid certain words from being preempted and captured, you know, like censorship, democracy, freedom of speech, and indeed to prevent this from happening, I think we do need to develop strategic narratives.
I think there's also a bottom-up level that democracies might have missed. I feel like there was such hope with social media that it would change authoritarian states, and many democracies didn't see that they also needed to adapt. And so I think in some ways we missed the boat of how to hear from people in a way that's more meaningful than like an online input. And now, I mean, this is striking to me because that article that I mentioned about coming up with a social media alternative was shared in a very local Facebook group where I live. And the response was very negative. And that's led me to think, how do you reach out to populations that may already be in a different reality than you, to understand what their concerns are such that they can actually be dealt with? And then who's going to be the legitimate actor that they would accept in building an alternative that might actually bring society back together? But I will end on the fact that I don't think that we should ever hope that we're going to build societies that have complete and total consensus. That wouldn't be healthy, and it's not going to lead to any kind of innovation or advancement. But we do have to find some way back to compromise.
Just quickly on the democracy shield. A shield is there to protect from vulnerabilities and not from attacks and from threat actors. So I just hope that we've seen in recent case studies that we have seen vulnerabilities and single point of failure into how specific recommender systems, how specific lack of application of the law was leading to this. And we can only hope that the shield will focus on these point of failures that are most urgent to treat than to only focus on threats, because solving the failure point will solve potentially more things. We had another question at the back. No, we don't have any more. Okay, so I have a written question here, but we can take other questions. I received this very nice paper. How can moderate voices inspire enthusiasm and mobilize like-minded individuals in a way that effectively counters the emotional pull and momentum often generated by more extreme views. I think it's a bit linked to our friend here said, just like, is there, and what you were just saying, Alicia, about how can we find the capacity to connect, to reconnect, and to re-engage positively in terms of negatively. And we tend to see right now that there is a focus on negativity. Some say it's because of design of platforms, some say it's because of the general economical environment or change of world perspective right now. Is there a way, and when we think about the whole of society approach, should we invest more into actually local community managers? In the old term of community manager that I used to know, which are not the people that are posting things on Instagram and TikTok, like really people going to connect the person at the corner of your street, which also helps to rally for democracy, local democracy, petitions, and all that kind of things. What happens to that places of socialization that have constantly been absorbed by the online world?
I mean, this is the thing. We have been so focused on the online world, I think we forgot about the offline world. And in some ways, we're not really engaging those places where humans are connecting. We're connecting here. This is a real space. Yes, people are listening to us on YouTube, but we're here together, and that shouldn't be discounted. So is that like moderate voices who are also extremely patient? Because I feel like
they inspire enthusiasm and mobilize like-minded individuals.
Well, they would be like the unicorns that we need to build bridges right now. Like, I feel like moderate people, especially who have the patience to listen to both sides, could effectively start to provide a bridge between two growing extremes, right? I worry that two extremes are pulling everybody from the middle. And there is an importance of trying to keep the ground. And maybe that's the weird thing that needs to be advocated for new political parties. Maybe there is nothing wrong with the center. Maybe we need to bring that back. Maybe that is the rallying cry.
Yeah, and maybe we should also have more engagement in general, so in political parties and in unions and all of these intermediary bodies that have been slowly, I would say, put on the side because of more direct democracy, more direct touch. And it's very interesting that media is often described as, deforming, distorting, and stuff, but like the role of media is to be in the middle. That's in the name. It's translating and it's being in the middle. So how can we re-insufflate this kind of, mediation between different actors so we can have debates?
I want to turn to the practitioners. I've been out of practice for a long time.
I would love to mention one project that I heard about, didn't experience it myself. It's called We Need to Talk in France. And it's an initiative to bring people together who really don't think the same. So it's basically a matchmaking project where you're a match with people who have completely opposite views, and then you just have coffee and then you talk. I heard this advocated also yesterday at the Riga conference. Someone said, let's talk about deep listening. I didn't know about this, but which was a really same idea of bringing together heavy meat eater with a vegan, and then having them really listen to each other's conviction and positions before they started dialogue. But anyway, I think there's a couple of such initiatives.
In citizen assemblies and deliberative democracy, there are approaches that engage like random average citizens in decision making.
Two examples from the parliament. I think there was an attempt with the Conference on the Future of Europe. Yes, it didn't bring a lot of changes to as such, the set of the treaties in the European Union, but it was a fantastic exercise of deliberation, direct democracy in a way, with citizens coming from the 27 member states from very different origin, young, old, very interested in EU affairs, completely distant, very different political views, but that took the time to come to Strasbourg, discuss different topics with the support of experts, and engage for months in deliberations on how they would see and would want the future to be shaped. And the output has probably not been solved enough, but it's really interesting that they come with concrete output. And that's one of the learning points that we took in consideration when we had the design of the information campaign for the election, because we saw a community that the Parliament called Together.eu, but that was also engaged by the Commission. We saw people that turned to us saying, I want to be part of, I want to do something. And we had 64,000 people that engaged in the elections and organized events, remote events in their communities, in their libraries, in their schools, in their collectivities to say, okay, on my topic, I'm a beekeeper. Okay, what do we do to the well-being of bees at European level? We need to engage and protect it. And we saw this engagement that was very new from, again, 5 years before, for collective exchange of views, a bit far away from sometimes the social media, really meeting in different countries, meeting at cross-border places also among 2 or 3 countries. And this is something we want to continue to invest in, because we see that people want to talk, really want to exchange those views. And it's a bit the spirit of this, like, let's meet and talk. They have different viewpoints at the beginning, but it's only through dialogue that one moment they come to compromises, and it departs a bit from this polarizing effects the social media have, because if you place them in the same room, in the end, well, it comes to some results. So at least those are at least grains that we will continue to invest in. No, and it's not anonymous, it's really persons looking each other in the eye.
So we talked about better understanding of the information environment and its complexity, investing into more research, and also have more voices and more decentralization and whole of society approach. I think that's a fantastic summary of this panel. Thank you so much for being here, and have a great evening, everybody. Thank you.